apenas el inicio de una campaña hasta el fin del golpismo. Porque el pueblo salió a la calle y Brasil está unido por una causa en común. Fuera Temer.
Good evening and welcome to a new series of The World Today. As we begin this series, there is a huge crisis in Brazil, the largest South American state and a vital state both for South America and North America. So how did this crisis begin, and is there a way out of it? What we have witnessed is a brutal, well-organized, well-orchestrated impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, the legally elected president of Brazil, by a combination of her former allies and the Brazilian judiciary. So how did it start? Dilma began her second term as president in January 2015. The vote was down compared to 2010, but then so was the Brazilian economy. Her lead over her rival, Governor Aécio Neves and his Brazilian Social Democracy Party, was 3%, but it was a clear-cut victory. Neves took the industrialized South. Dilma and Lula's PT dominated the North, winning 72% in this region, much better than last time. 3 months after her triumph, the streets of every major city were packed with angry demonstrators. The Workers' Party nosedived in the opinion polls. Despite everything, it had remained the country's most popular political party. It was now the most unpopular. Its former leader, Lula, told an inner circle, "One day we won the election, the next day we lost it." Why? We know why. It's not a secret. We know what happened. The Brazilian economy had grown by 7.5% even after the Wall Street crash of 2008. It was this that helps explain Dilma's success in 2010. At first, she appeased the markets and the financial press, just as Lula had done after his first triumph. Now that they have turned on the Workers' Party, one shouldn't forget, and I never do, what the Economist and Financial Times stable of writers were saying about Brazil during the Lula presidency. They saw him as a bulwark against the radical Chavistas in Venezuela and the Bolivarians in general. In a book, Michael Reed, the foreign editor of The Economist, a shameless defender of the Washington Consensus, said that the worst nightmare facing the continent was not 2008, but Chavez. Not the crash of 2008 that he couldn't even foresee. Reed held up Mexico, Chile, and Brazil as perfect models of democratic reformism and a broad political consensus because these governments were neoliberal in their approach. Chile had stuck to the Pinochet economic model, which, by the way, is now in serious trouble. Mexico, he admitted, did have some problems, but these could be sorted out. They haven't been sorted out, and the situation in Mexico has got even worse. Brazil had stuck to financial orthodoxy and was doing well as a result. As for Chavez, the man from The Economist repeated the litany of lies one could read every day in all the elite liberal and conservative papers of Europe and North America. To give it a special touch, Reed resorted to the disgusting racism common to the Creole elites in South America. He expressed it in a very English way. Chávez's supporters, we were told, tended to be poorer, darker-skinned Venezuelans linked to him by a quasi-religious bond. The message was clear: Brazil good, Venezuela bad. But the crisis had finally reached Brazil. Growth fell sharply, and the government embarked on a different course, with a new package intended to encourage investment for sustained development. Interest rates were lowered, electricity costs reduced, loans to the private sector from private banks increased, and a currency devaluation, together with limited, very limited, control of capital movements. The stimulus initially appeared to work. 2 years into her presidency, Dilma's approval rating was 75%. But then the economy slowed down from an already low 2.7% in 2011 to just 1% in 2012. With inflation over 6% in April 2013, the central bank insisted on raising interest rates, instantly reducing the new reformist course undertaken by Guido Mantega, the finance minister, to shambles. Public expenditure, as is usually the case, was targeted and reduced. The result took everyone by surprise. The decision to raise bus fares in June 2013 was the catalyst. It triggered a wave of protests that spread from Sao Paulo to the entire country, engulfing 350 cities and towns. Millions and millions of people were in the streets of the country. The government was shaken. It was clear during the early stages of these actions that they were spontaneous, and many on the left whispered to each other, might these be our June days? A reference reaching far back in history to the prelude of the 1848 revolutions in France and Europe. It was not to be. The government rescinded the fare increases, and the movement more or less ended. It was a serious warning of discontent to come, a display of anger with the huge amounts of money being spent on prestige projects. Billions had been spent on the World Cup. Some of the banners carried by protesters read, "I don't want World Cup, I want health and education. We want FIFA standard hospitals. The giant has woken up. I was going to write something clever, but I ain't educated." It was a funny country. No schools, only stadiums. Everyone against corruption. Dilma out. They're all corrupt. PT equals pillage and treachery. Despite this political earthquake, with Dilma accusing her PSDB opponent of slashing public expenditure and ending all social gains if he won, it worked. She argued that only her party worked for the poor and underprivileged. She won. Even before her new term had begun, a fatal decision was made to reverse the new course, get rid of Guido Mantega, the reformist finance minister, and she suddenly, without warning, embarked on austerity measures. The new finance minister, a Chicago-trained boss of the asset management division of Brazil's largest bank, was given a free hand to restore confidence, curb inflation, and so on. It was a crazy decision. It meant huge cuts in social spending, reduced credit from public banks, selling off state assets, rising interest rates to 14.25%, and the results were predictable: a full-blown recession, failing investment, and a doubling of unemployment. Subsidies to private companies exceeded the Bolsa Familia, the social handout given to the poorest families in the country. Her popularity disappeared overnight. Her own supporters were livid, referring to her election promises as an embezzlement. They felt cheated because she had simply stolen her opponents' clothes. The opponents, some of whom had been in her coalition, now decided to make a bid for power via a constitutional coup. Using the means available to bring her down, they decided to impeach her on vague and nebulous charges. That the Workers' Party itself played political monopoly, the money game that has been part of the institutionally corrupt Brazilian political system for decades, is undeniable. In Lula's first 2 terms, there were a number of cases of PT politicians carting huge sums of money to bribe smaller parties and worse. The infamously regressive tax structure bequeathed by Cardoso to Lula, penalizing the poor to pamper the rich, was left untouched. The PT's base began to wither. The trade unions were in decline and no longer combative. The poor were passive recipients of state money and PT rule, which had never educated or organized them, let alone mobilized them as a collective force, highlighting the difference with the Bolivarians in neighboring countries. Social movements, of which the landless peasants are the largest, or the homeless, had been kept at a distance, and the critical intellectuals inside the Workers' Party were effectively marginalized and replaced by spin doctors and PR people of the worst sort. The party, in other words, had become an electoral machine and lost much of its base. Her second presidency was immersed in scandals of every sort. Petrobras, the oil giant, suffering financially from the decline in prices, laid off thousands of workers. Bosses of corrupt construction companies are in jail. The billionaire head of BTG Pactual, the continent's biggest investment bank, and the toast of the Financial Times and The Economist, was taken away in handcuffs. The neoliberal spending cuts and tax increases proposed by the government were thwarted by the neoliberal PSDB to embarrass it. A budget for 2016 has yet to be passed. Seeing their opportunity, Brazil's right wing struck, and struck hard. On a personal level, they have nothing that implicates Dilma in corruption. Nothing. And we have to be very clear on this. The charges against Dilma were rigged, were false, and everyone knows it. But they went ahead rather than wait for the 2018 election. Most of these rogues and scoundrels are themselves being investigated for corruption. One of the more comical sides in the impeachment of Dilma was how the members of the Senate, at the behest of the Speaker Eduardo Cunha, deputy after deputy in the Parliament, paying no attention whatsoever to the charges that were nominally held against Rousseff. No mention of them or what she was charged with. They rose in Parliament, one after the other, to invoke God and the family as they cast their votes in favor of driving her from office. Why? Because they now were scared that if they couldn't get rid of her, the price they would have to pay for their corruptions, and these are not imagined or fictional corruptions, but very real. And again, the whole country knows this, despite the support they received from the right-wing press. They had to now get rid of her, or they themselves were going to lose their places. And so they acted now both viciously and out of fear that they might go down. 3 of Temer's ministers have already been forced to resign their positions. Romero Jussa, Minister of Planning, the first minister to resign. Jussa had a private conversation recorded and leaked in which he defends Dilma's impeachment as the only way to stop the bleeding caused by the car wash investigation and thus avoid accusations and prosecutions against more politicians. Romero Jussa is currently being investigated within car wash and also for diverting public resources and electoral fraud. After resigning his position from Temer's government, Jussa, who is also affiliated to the PMDB, assumed the presidency of the party. So not a minister, but still president of the political party. Fabiano Silveira, Minister of Transparency, Monitoring and Control. One of Temer's first measures as interim president was to transform the CGU, a semi-independent and autonomous fiscal body responsible for scrutinizing the work of the Brazilian government in a ministry, thus linking it with the figures of the minister and the president and weakening its independent character. The first minister of this new ministry was forced to resign after he was heard plotting against Dilma Rousseff and the car wash in a leaked recording. He was recorded while in private conversation with the President of the Senate, Renan Calheiros. Henrico Eduardo Alves, Minister of Tourism, was forced to resign his position after the former president of a state-owned transportation company admitted passing him over 1.55 million reals from the Petrobras resources between 2008 and 2014. And so it goes, with each cabinet minister now under watch, with politicians who got rid of Dilma being accused of money laundering, with the money being taken into Swiss bank accounts. These are the jokers who have effectively got rid of Dilma Rousseff. Now, what does this show? We have to learn some lessons from it, because the new elections in 2018 are going to be decisive for the future of Brazil. Dilma, while she has been removed as president because of this bogus impeachment, can run again, but opinion polls are not friendly. The person who is way ahead in the opinion polls today and would win easily with a huge majority is the former president, Lula. Will he run? His health is fine. He has been actively opposing this farce taking place in Brazil. He is in a combative mood. The only way they can stop him is to try and have him disqualified. How would they get him disqualified? By charging him with fraud or corruption or something or the other, and making sure that he goes to prison or is found guilty. That would effectively get rid of him. And given the way in which the Brazilian judiciary, totally supported and goaded by the O Globo chain of newspapers and the right-wing press in general are going, it's not impossible that they might bring this off. However, against this, we are now beginning to see, for the first time since the crisis began, a gathering of forces. When I spoke recently in Brazil to João Pedro Stedile, the leader of the landless peasants movement, he was very clear that there is a great deal of anger now at what the right have done, and critics are uniting with the PT and other groups on the left likewise to make sure that the right doesn't win. So if there are attempts made to get rid of Lula through a set of bogus or unproven charges, my own feeling is that there will be some mass resistance, because they have behaved so badly and so appallingly that it is clear even to people who are not very political that what has been going on is chicanery on a massive level. Interestingly enough, from Rio de Janeiro, the former army parachutist Jair Bolsonaro exulted that this was a victory like that of 1964, when the military saved the country from communism. That was his interpretation. And he dedicated the ballot to the memory of Colonel Carlos Brilhante Ustra, the torturer-in-chief of the dictatorship that followed. He had reason to celebrate. Without the 37 votes supplied by his ultra-right-wing semi-fascist party, the launch to impeachment would have failed. So this then was the assembly of right-wing forces, from apologists from the military dictatorship to those who had been allies of Dilma Rousseff till very recently. Temer, the current president, was her vice president. And this assembly of forces that got rid of her was remarkable in Brazilian politics, because the one thing that we had thought till now, that all Brazilian parties, with the exception of the ultra-right, absolutely despised and loathed, was those associated with the military coup of 1964, which was a vicious coup d'etat carried out with Washington's support, naturally, and which led to mass arrests, tortures, censorship, etc., the usual. The one bloc which has been quiet so far, and which few have talked about, is, of course, the American intelligence agencies. What have they been up to? We may not yet have any evidence as to US involvement in the current constitutional coup against Dilma. What we do know comes from official US files revealed by WikiLeaks, which is that Brazil's new interim president, Michel Temer, was an embassy informant for US intelligence. Temer communicated with the American embassy in Brazil via telegram, and such content would be classified as sensitive and for official use only. If this was the case in 2006, and there is absolutely no evidence that Temer's politics have changed, we can probably say with some confidence that what happened in Brazil today happened with the knowledge and the agreement and the approval of the American embassy. The attitude of the PT governments to the United States has been double-edged. On the one hand, for a long time, as I've pointed out, they supported the economic pattern set by the Washington Consensus. On the other side, Lula, apart from one huge mistake of sending Brazilian troops to participate in the occupation of Haiti, organized by the United States and France, has refused to play the game that every Brazilian government used to play with the United States of America, of doing their bidding and acting as a regional hegemon on behalf of the United States. This he didn't do, and from this there was a complete break. Attempts by successive US presidents to get the Brazilian PT government to destabilize Venezuela, to destabilize Bolivia, to put pressure on the government of Ecuador didn't work. And nor did President Lula accept that the American blockade of Cuba was justifiable. In fact, soon after he became president, Lula, like many of the Bolivarian presidents, flew to Havana to exchange embraces and hugs with Fidel Castro and thank the Cubans for all the support they had given to the Brazilian left during the dark years of dictatorship, when many Brazilians had been given refuge and asylum in Cuba. So on Cuba, on the Bolivarians, Lula remained more or less solid. And the Americans did not like this. They ignored it because there was nothing they could do. And since for them the economy was the single most important thing, as long as that was under control, they were happy. But lately, there was more pressure coming from them, as we know, just reading from their press, that perhaps it was time to turn the tide back in the whole of South America. It irritated them what had happened in Venezuela. Chavez was, of course, dead, and they began we know this now, it's not a huge secret, destabilizing the Maduro regime in Venezuela. They made threatening noises against Evo Morales in Bolivia, and they made clear their dislike of President Correa in Ecuador. They had started to do this already, and they must have thought, wouldn't it be nice if Brazil was ours again? Not as a direct colony, of course, but acting in our interests, on our behalf, in this region, which is still unsettled and where we haven't completely succeeded so far in returning to the old status quo. And if that is the case, they must be very pleased with what has happened in Brazil at the moment. In fact, the former President Lula remarked to a Venezuelan friend, you know, I think Hugo Chavez was right about the Americans. It was a private remark, but indicated quite a lot as to what they know about what has been going on and which they haven't yet made public. But it's not over in Brazil. Dilma's impeachment represents a huge setback and a defeat. But as I've tried to explain today, the reasons for that defeat are not exclusively external. Many, many mistakes have been made. We have outlined some of them, and there are others too. So for Brazil to succeed in the future, Lula, if he wins again, or Dilma, if she wins again, or there's another combined radical candidate, have to learn from these mistakes and understand that unless and until something is done about providing the country with a social infrastructure that benefits the poor, the less well-off, and sections of the middle classes, they were the main ones who protested when fares went up, that unless that is done, the country will remain a permanent hostage to right-wing forces inside it and their supporters in the northern part of the hemisphere.